thank you all for being here and joining me this morning. So the digital asset regulatory outlook, I think the biggest question on everyone's minds right now in terms of crypto regulation is market structure legislation. So what do you all make of the progress that we've seen so far in market structure legislation? And do you see this, making it across the finish line before the end of the year?
It's a Senate question. You want to start with the Senate?
Are you trying to say the House did their job already? Is that what you're trying to say? I think it'll definitely get passed before the end of the year. This obviously passed overwhelmingly in the House. Congratulations to you guys for leading that effort. 78 Democrats joining virtually every Republican is an incredible accomplishment. The House is just newer than the Senate, and I think that's the biggest issue, and you can interpret what I mean by newer. So as a result of that, there's a little bit of an educational lift that the House didn't have, but I think we'll get something marked up in the next couple of weeks and get it across the finish line before the end of the year.
I mean, if we build on it, I mean, the House last Congress with Chairman McHenry, then chair of the subcommittee French Hill, did yeoman's work to move through Fit 21. And that was in a very different political dynamic than we're in today, right? That was with an idea that we might have an opportunity to drive this forward such that the Senate would pick it up and maybe Biden would move it forward. And we gained significant Democratic support in that. It was a spectacular job. We entered this Congress in a very new political environment. We have President Trump who is leaning in, trying to make the United States, I think the golden age of digital assets. I think we're making spectacular strides. We have positive friends in the Senate that are leading into digital assets and created a new framework and clarity. And I think what we're watching is the Senate beginning this negotiation, and the hope is that they reach resolution, and in my comments both publicly and privately, is if we use clarity as the base text in the Senate, that in amend or adjust off of that text, we have an opportunity to move faster than watching a de novo process. We'll let the Senate work their will. But I think that there is absolutely proven that there is a political landing pad where you can garner significant support, and passing anything in the House with 2/3 of the entire House of Representatives in support shows you the energy behind making sure that we pass this legislation, because there is significant capital sitting on the sidelines that's waiting to be deployed on the other side of having clarity in this regulatory space.
And just very quickly, I want to give compliment to our subcommittee chairman here. I mean, Bryan has led a heroic effort both in clarity and then working with the Senate on Genius. And let's not forget where we were just 3 years ago when FTX collapsed. Look, we had a long way to go here in the United States to come up with some type of regulatory environment. A lot of it has rested on that all of us are new to this, including the House, and we are depending on our private partners to be able to come forward with real structure on the guys who are doing it the right way so that we don't have a repeat of the past. And so in the last 6 months of the 119th Congress, the House Financial Services and House Ag, two committees that don't have a lot of overlap jurisdiction, work together with the Senate, and we have to remind ourselves that both the SEC and the CFTC, the commodities and the securities markets coming into this digital asset space, was something new for a lot of people on the policy side. So I think we should not underestimate the incredible amount of work that's already been fomented and executed within the first 6 months. And as the Senate notes, we've got a runway here to be successful within a year. That is historic by any nature. Just look at the government shutdown. This is something that's actually getting done in Washington.
I'm extremely underqualified to state whether the bill will pass or not amongst the colleagues here. But what I would say from a private sector perspective, and Representative Steil said it right, we're extremely optimistic seeing Genius get passed and seeing Clarity hopefully get passed by the end of the year. Strategy raised $40 billion in the capital markets in the last 2 years. That's one company, $40 billion. If we are able to open up the regulatory framework for banks and crypto companies, DeFi companies, and TradFi to enter this space and create clarity, I think that's the opportunity for the country. And I think you see that ahead of you. So we're all really excited about what's going to hopefully happen very soon.
It makes you feel better for everybody here. We actually have 3 meetings today on this very topic. So there's a meeting with the Democrats, there's a meeting with Republicans, there's a meeting where we're together. So there's a lot of momentum on this. And look, this is really not partisan. I think we should all agree on that. This is not a Democrat versus Republican issue. This is more of understanding the topic, and then once you understand the topic, you understand that the essential part is that America leads, as we always have in financial services. And once you kind of wrap your head around that, it typically goes much faster than typically things happen in DC.
Yeah, and as this legislation moves forward, for the three lawmakers we have up here, what have been areas of bipartisan agreement, and then what are some of those sticking points that you guys are still dealing with, as you're trying to get this across the finish line?
Maybe I'll take the first shot and then pass it down the line. I think Senator Moreno said it correctly. It is how do you provide consumer protections and encourage innovation and development inside the United States, knowing the success we had going back all the way to the 33 and 34 Act on the security side, that we set up this in a similar way for the digital assets environment. That is where the agreement is. Then, as you look at the dials and you look at BSA, AML, and we can come back to that, you can turn the dial either way. You don't want to blow a hole in the 33 and 34 Act, and you also don't want to throttle this so much that innovation and development is occurring outside the United States. And so I think what we, again, going back to my previous comment on clarity, I think as you look at some of these dials, as you move them, what we found was a landing pad where we could garner support across the spectrum of lawmakers. And I think those negotiations are always at play, but you're looking at how do you land this, how do you define these terms, and who in the regulatory environment has that primary role. And I think working with all stakeholders, industry as well, I think we found that landing pad in clarity, and I think that hopefully encouraged our Senate colleagues to come to the table on that.
I would just build on things that Bryan said in three main ways where I see real bipartisan support, both in the committees of jurisdiction in the House side, but also with what we're working on in the Senate. First and foremost is being able to establish one of the bills that we passed, the Financial Technology Protection Act. It was a complement to both Genius and to Clarity to say we're going to bring together our best in law enforcement, our best in the intelligence sector, along with our private partners and non-profit partners to be able to say, how do we actually get after this? In the same way we went after cybersecurity, fraud, and threats, these are things that we need to have in a US-based ability to make sure that there's consumer trust in what we're trying to do in the digital asset space. And it complements something else we're working on in financial services right now, the GUARD Act, the amount of scams, the theft, to make real equity in this digital asset space not seem like something that only the very rich or the very risk-prone tend to do, but somebody back home in Iowa or Wisconsin or Ohio or Indiana could also have the opportunity to do. The second piece of this, then, I would say, is that we also need to look at where this underlies. We've got the original Clarity Act was actually based on blockchain, how we get US-based blockchain to become the driving factor for all types of, compartmentalized information and deep storage that we've got. Right now, we're seeing real competition, just like we saw in digital assets, coming out of China. So of course, this is an area where we want to have not only dominance in digital asset, but we want to have the underlying rails of how this operation is going to work, US-based, US-managed, and US-proven. And the third piece I would say here is that we really want to get after, for the bipartisan piece here, what we can do on the taxation of this. One of the things we were talking about today with, Bitcoin mining is an area where there's double taxation on the front and the back end. We're working with Senator Gillibrand now in eliminating that so that we have the opportunity to really make sure that this is a place not only it can be successful, but it can thrive without the IRS hitting it on both the front end and the back end for our miners who are actually helping create wealth in this space.
No thoughts on how the legislation's going? No, to answer your question, I think where there's a lot of bipartisan consensus is around protecting consumers, making certain that money laundering protections are set at the right dial. I like that analogy. I think there's consensus even now that America has to lead. The understanding that our financial assets are the gold standard because we have a good regulatory system. I think there's broad consensus on that. The challenging points are self-custody because there's not a lot of understanding of what that really means. So I think that's more of a not partisan issue, but I'm not sure what that means issue. And then decentralized finance tends to maybe blow up some people's heads because they don't really see that. So they conflate the developer's role versus the user's role and how the system works. So that's more of an educational lift than it is a philosophical lift. And that's where we're basically almost at the end of that. Like I said, that's what gives me great confidence. And by the way, you should know, we're working hand in hand with the House as we do these things. So we're not sitting here in the Senate crafting something new in isolation and not communicating with the House. We meet quite often so that whatever we send back is not something that can't pass the House.
I'll just add one thing. I think the private sector analogy of the need for bipartisan support, everybody wants this to happen in a constructive way. On the private sector side is the debate between digital native companies and traditional finance banks, each thinking that this is a I win, you lose situation. And I don't think that's the case at all. I think for this to work in America, there are many individuals who rely on a traditional financial system and will more likely invest in Bitcoin and digital assets and get the asymmetric risk returns out of it, which is great for individual citizens. And we need the traditional finance companies to be part of this. And I think that's super important as we go through this legislation, that the JP Morgans and the Bank of Americas and the Citibanks and the Wells Fargos realize there's a role for them in this legislation, and they're going to become part of the digital native world. And as a company that relies on them, as a public company that offers its securities underwritten by the traditional finance system, I'm excited to see Clarity bring these two groups together in a constructive way.
If I could just put an exclamation
Good luck
mark,
with that.
If I could just get an exclamation mark on that, because it's very interesting. The thing that's new to me, never having been in D.C. prior to January 3rd of this year for more than a day, is that I didn't know it was a thing where companies came here to get a strategic advantage over their competitors. Like, I didn't realize that that was something businesses did. I'm like, wait, what? How does this work? And for the 4 years of the Biden administration, the banking system was under such siege and attack from a regulatory perspective that their viewpoint now is like, look, all these other companies were out there innovating, creating cool things, doing some really interesting work. We're just trying to survive. And so now that we've taken back the regulatory system to be more common sense, they feel like, well, these guys got a 4-year head start on us. And maybe that's true. That's the answer. But that's not going to hinder our desire to be the leader of the world in this space.
And I think the regulated entities are actually hungry for this to pass. So if you go back, not only were they hindered in many ways on these traditional financial systems that were under attack, but you also had Chairman Gensler working aggressively to prevent these financial institutions from engaging almost in any way in this space. And so I think in many ways, a lot of the traditional finance, the regulated entities, actually have a huge opportunity here for clear rules of the road such that they can engage in this space in a way that they were prevented from in the previous administration.
Yeah, and Mr. Lee, coming back to you, from an industry perspective, what are the issues that you are following most closely within market structure legislation and are most important to you and your company?
Yeah, we're a pretty simple company. We buy and we hold Bitcoin, right? That's pretty much what we do. And there are a lot of companies, I mean, Bitcoin mining, God bless you, that's a much more complicated business than what we do. And so there are a couple of things that matter to us, the proper taxation of Bitcoin. And thanks to Senator Moreno and Senator Lummis and Senator Justice, representatives that are here, Representative Jack Steil, we passed, or not passed, we got the IRS to exclude digital assets from unfair corporate alternative minimum tax and taxing on unrealized gains. And by the way, you know, as someone who's very new to this process also, it was amazing to see how that works and gets done and how things get done on the Hill. And I was very impressed by that. We have the double taxation issue with Bitcoin mining also. I think if those two things get codified into law, and get resolved, it opens up innovation. Like, there could be a lot of reasons why companies want to hold Bitcoin in the balance sheet. So I think fixing the taxation issue first and foremost is important. And then the second one, which we just talked about, is really finding an opening so that both the traditional banking system and the digital native companies can work together to advance Bitcoin ownership and digital asset ownership for the country, right? Like, I'd love to see a place where right now we custody our Bitcoin with primarily digital native companies and Fidelity. I'd love to see a place where custody services are provided by large banks. Once you provide custody services, then you can let someone, you can get loans against your Bitcoin, you get yield off your Bitcoin. Those are all great things. And so inserting Bitcoin into the traditional banking system just opens up innovation, but it really just opens up access for a lot of folks right now. So those are the two big important things for us, specifically from a private sector perspective.
An issue that I think we've already touched on a little bit is the concerns around illicit finance and sanctions evasion, which come up a lot in terms of crypto. How much of an issue is this for the industry, and how are you all thinking about this and grappling with this in legislation?
I think one of the biggest questions is what is the baseline with which we should analyze this? Because you have a lot of conversation about this in the digital asset space. And when you have that conversation, you say, wait a minute, wait until you learn about cash. Because as you step back, what is the baseline which we should be analyzing it? We don't want any financial transaction to occur in any aspect with illicit finance. No one wants terrorism to be funded. No one wants it for drug trafficking. True. Then the question is, does the regulatory framework we're putting in place help or hinder that development? So having this occurring offshore, if you throttle this in a way that this innovation and development is occurring offshore outside the control of U.S. regulators, I actually think you hurt yourself and you assist people that want to engage in illicit activity. Then the question is also, how do you leverage the technology that's in this space? So in many ways, the distributed ledger technology is actually disincentivizing individuals to engage in illicit finance. And so you don't want to allow perfection to be the enemy of the good. If we left digital assets and we went to another area and you said self-driving cars, is the standard that your self-driving car is absolutely flawless, or is it better than a human? And so I think as we're looking at, again, kind of where you land the dial on BSA AML, I think you have to look at the broader technology environment that allows us to prevent a lot of this from occurring on the front end. And then second, what is the standard with which we should be analyzing the success rate that we have in the digital asset space?
I'll just quickly hit on, I think, there are four elements of this. Look, as Bryan noted, anything that we're going to push offshore is immediately going to go wherever there's a return on investment. And so when we look at the illicit finance side, who are partners with us and who have been pioneers in this space? Singapore, the UK, Malta, Bermuda, they've been working on this for a while. There are best practices there that we should be incorporating. By the way, they're also partners who, when it comes to a sanctions regime, particularly against Southeast Asia and Russia, they've been there with us every step of the way. The second model is really the European Union's approach to this of massive regulation, which effectively has driven out a lot of the investment from the area, meaning they have less ability to be influential when it comes to sanctions. It also means they're less likely to step into the world. It's really, in my opinion, it's the Maxine Waters approach to how we would do regulation. Look to Europe, that's exactly what Maxine would do if she had been the chairwoman. The third approach, which I'm very concerned about, are the folks who really do want to have digital assets become the tradable illicit finance of choice. This is the failed state, but as well as the support of a lot of people who are trying to get capital who are limited by other ways. Whether these are the Ayatollahs in Tehran, whether this is potentially what's happening in North Korea and Russia, and certainly there's a huge opening there for what President Xi would like to be able to do behind the curtain on how to move a lot of money very quickly with limited ability to be sanctioned by this or limit to who he can do. And then that leaves us to the fourth column. This is where I think the United States, again, in the last 6 months, has really developed a proactive approach to saying, let's onboard this, let's keep our friends close, but let's also identify a regulatory environment that can be both carrot and stick, but to give us the overwhelming ability, just like we have with the dollar, to be able to come in with the heavy weapons when we need to and put sanctions in place that will truly execute what U.S. national security interests are, rather than playing around the periphery or working across these other three columns of trying to identify how are we actually going to get sanctions done. Otherwise, everyone will simply bleed to a digital asset platform and be able to circumvent sanctions going forward.
Yeah, look, Bryan said it perfectly. The outlook can't be we're going to develop a new financial system that is completely immune to bad actors. It's just not possible. But the one thing we can do later, we don't want to hold up this progress, is maybe we can look at a model like CISA that deals with cybersecurity, that engages the private sector and the public sector to try to attack bad actors together. Because if you go to all these three-letter agencies, and there's a lot of them, they're working really hard to try to clamp down on this, and it's good work. Like, we want to encourage that. They just don't have the capacity. Like I go back to when I built my company using blockchain back in 2014. To find somebody who could code in blockchain, it didn't exist. Now today it's different, but the capacity building has really moved almost primarily to the private sector, and there's just not a lot of expertise in the public sector yet. So if we could put together a CISA-type framework that says, let's work together, government and private business, to help attack bad actors, I think it'd be great for the industry.
Is this something that, is in the market structure legislation, or that you think comes after a bit more? Are you immediately dealing with this now, or is this something you think that we need to continue working out?
I think we need to start thinking about these things now. But what we don't want to do is craft legislation that solves every potential problem going forward, because we'll never get it done. So I think it's about sequencing, and let's get. I view it much like writing tech, right? Sprints. Our first sprint was stablecoins. Our second sprint is market structure. It doesn't mean we're done. We keep going because we're doing something that's never been done before. We've never actually created a regulatory environment before or in the absence of a crisis. Typically, it's very reactionary what we do in DC. I know that's shocking to everybody here. So this is the first time we're actually proactively working with industry, preemptively saying, how do we create an ecosystem in which innovation flourishes? And just to be clear, we will get things wrong, but we're going to come back at it and fix it and make it better. That's exactly what I mean by this idea of sprints along the way. And the engagement of the private sector in this process has been absolutely critical to get consensus, and that's very, very important.
And industry is thoroughly engaged in this space. I'll let folks on the industry side dive in on it, but that is, I think, actually the real key is leveraging the technology, as noted from the private sector.
I love the sprint analogy. In our business, we run 2-week sprints. How long are your sprints?
17 years. No, we're trying. No, actually, it's very important because it's not been well reported. I think history will look back at President Trump's second term and say he's the first president that brought velocity to government. This idea that government has to be slow, has to be overly bureaucratic. Just my experience, again, I have no frame of reference. I'd never been in any government position in my life until January. And I can tell you that when something needs to happen, and the normal point of view is, well, let's have staff review it, and we'll write long memos, and we'll send out letters. I'm like, well, that's silly. I'll just call Dr. Oz and ask him. And then the answer is, sure, Bernie, we'll take care of that. And then, boom, it's done. That's the way government should work. And by the way, needs to work if we're going to be hyper-competitive in the new world that we're in. These other countries aren't sitting back and saying, oh, America's always going to lead. We have to bring velocity to government. So I think to answer your question, and I was joking, 17 years, I think we can get this stuff done pretty quickly. We've, by any previous standard, what we've done in the banking committee in the Senate, especially compared to the predecessor of Tim Scott, who's the guy I defeated, I mean, we are running in hyperspeed. Hyperspeed. He did 0 markups in 4 years. Now, by the way, that's probably a good thing in retrospect, considering who was there. But we've gotten a lot of things done, and we'll continue to get even more done, especially once we break through this educational barrier that we had.
The iterative process you're talking about is actually refreshing to think about, because I think a lot of folks think about clarity as a law set in stone and that will sit there forever. If I think about the structure of clarity, and I think about it a very simple way, you have digital commodities, you have digital securities, and digital tokens. I do think, and our bias, the digital commodity is Bitcoin. And it should be very difficult for something, whether it be 2 weeks or 17 years, it should be very difficult for things to rise to digital commodity status. I think on the digital token side, there's still a lot of work to be done. And maybe to your point, it doesn't have to be done up front. It can be done over time. Because that's really how folks are going to, how entrepreneurs are going to access capital without having to register and become an SEC registered public company, which is we are. There's a huge regulatory burden associated with that, which is why I love this idea of not related to clarity, but I love the idea of having the option to only only report earnings twice a year as opposed to quarterly. So I do think there's a huge opportunity for digital tokens to open up access to capital for private companies without having to register the SEC. And so I think there will need to be work done there, and I think it doesn't have to all be figured out up front, which is great to hear.
Julia, I do want to say, though, with all the great innovation that's happening in this space, for the public trust to be there, we have to be able to do this in lockstep. And so I think you're absolutely right. On the Sprint side, we have the opportunity to do two things at once here. This is why when we pass Genius, we also in the same breath pass FTPA. One of the things that, Britt's working on in the Senate with us right now is a Financial Technology Protection Act, so that when I go home and I see a grandmother at the grocery store shoving her life savings into a crypto ATM that goes to a digital asset that she's never going to get back, and a scammer has told her that her son's in prison in Mexico City, she doesn't become the poster child for why we have a crisis that balloons up and all of a sudden members of Congress show up and say, this can never happen again. Look, nothing motivates DC like a good old-fashioned crisis. If it's happening to a grandmother in Iowa, then the reality is that billions of dollars are on the line, and that we have a responsibility both on the federal side but also on the private sector side to say, who are the best actors in this space? Nobody wants to be able to onshore an FTX problem. We want to onshore this so we can eliminate the FTX problem. We don't want to onshore illicit financing through a new digital asset. We want to be able to provide both the confidence to be able to invest in this, while at the same time recognizing there are bad actors out there, and what can we do in this space, both through the SEC and the CFTC, to be able to eliminate that earlier on, or at least draw the flag, and our private partners being able to highlight, we're doing this right, let us be successful. We'll also help identify who is failing in this space and call them out appropriately.
So there's been a lot of concerns over the years from industry that the U.S. has lagged behind on creating this regulatory framework. And I think, as you all have mentioned, there's concerns about pushing the industry overseas. How much do you think that this is still an issue? We've seen a lot of progress. The Genius Act was passed. It was signed into law. Do you think that this is still a real concern, or has this sort of pulled back a bit with the progress in Congress?
I think there's a lot of short-term wins. I think the administration has made great executive actions. I think Paul Atkins at the SEC has turned the tide from Gary Gensler. I feel really positive about all of that. The concern is that we know that's as good as it is for 3.5 years. And a lot of capital investment is looking at a longer runway before they're ready to make long-term investments. And so codifying this into law so that there's not an individual that ever comes to the SEC with a worldview that Gary Gensler held, I think is actually really essential to unlock the capital that wants to be invested. I was in an Asian country meeting with a finance minister, and we were talking about the actions that the United States was taking. They were a forward-looking country in the digital asset space. And after our meeting, as we were walking out, he leaned and said, if you guys get this done, you're going to take a lot of our business, which is actually just stuck with me of, holy cow, this is so essential. He knows he's in meetings, and the reason some businesses are investing, developing, innovating, hiring employees in that jurisdiction in Asia, and it's occurring in other countries around the world, is because the United States has historically throttled this. That doesn't mean no companies were working through the challenges in the United States. It just means a lot of companies weren't. And as we think about the currently regulated entities, traditional finance, a lot of them have held back massive capital investments that could be coming into this space. And so providing that long-term clarity that this is the legal framework with which you can operate in, complementing that with an executive branch that is incredibly lean forward, I think that really unlocks a lot more investment than what we have already seen in an industry that is actually seeing a fair amount of investment.
And I'll just take a note here. We did a lot in the first 6 months, but the rest of the world didn't sit on its heels and say like, oh, I guess the United States is taking this space. I mean, we were at the London Stock Exchange Group a month ago, and we saw the number of companies that were coming on board with the LSE to say, hey, we're going to compete in this space. We're going to make London the hub. Every country who wants to compete in this space is trying to do the exact same thing, from London to Singapore and everybody in between. We also need to recognize that, as the United States onboards more of this, we also have a responsibility to help shape what it's going to be. Elections have consequences, and I don't mean to make this political, but Bryan brought up the point, we have 3 years here under the executive branch to be able to do things. Well, we've only got 18 months left under this Congress to be able to help out the Senate pass something. If we have a seismic shift in the next election cycle and we change out chairman, that really has an impact, because again, we're talking about 4 committees of jurisdiction here, all needing to come together. They've worked well. We saw what happened in the 118th Congress when they did not work well together. We had a chilling effect on this. I want to give compliments to people here in the room. the Mara team has been a thought leader in this and getting people on both sides of the aisle to work together on this, but also getting, new and old, I think is the term correctly used here, to be able to identify where the vision of this could be for the United States. If we break that on the legislative side, it may take us another full cycle to be able to come back on board and continue to move on good legislation that we've already got teed up to be successful. But again, Congress doesn't get everything done in 18 months. We need to have a runway to make sure these things really take hold, really foster America's innovation in this space.
Tone at the top matters. What happened in November completely changed the industry, access to capital, 180 degrees, right? And I'm very optimistic that what happens in the next 4 years will be set in stone. As an example, there's 180 Bitcoin treasury companies around the world. I believe 60 to 70% of those are still in the U.S., right? And so we do have, there's this idea that we're behind. Like the U.S. is the most dominant, capital market in the world. New York City is the center of that capital market. We do still have a head start, and I think we're very much going in the right direction. If we get clarity passed, I'm very optimistic about where this all goes for the country.
I'll use, since it's F1 season, under the Biden administration, our car hadn't left the garage, and it was like 20 laps in, and the car was sitting in the garage, and Elizabeth Warren was lying in front of the car. So now the car left, and we've gotten pretty fast, and we're not necessarily have everybody behind us, but we're competitive. And we have to keep going. We have to keep at these sprints, like I just mentioned. We have to get this market structure bill across the finish line. Any delay there could take us off the track, and we cannot allow that to happen. Look, I'll say this. Gary Gensler was the greatest thing that ever happened to digital assets because he was so idiotic that it helped shine a light on what not to do. And so what we have to do is say, look, we have to move this forward. Again, it's very hard for DC to understand this. Not everything has to be partisan. Let's just get a financial regulatory environment in America so that we can lead the world. That has nothing to do with your political party, but unfortunately, in some ways, because of who leads those political parties, the people tend to get dragged into that area where they kind of group together in tribes and say, well, we don't like this. Well, I had a dinner, I won't say with whom, where I said, just tell me your concerns. Like, tell me, like, if you're concerned about something, let me address them for you. And then he laid out a sequence of nonsense that was so difficult to untangle that I was like, holy Lord. He literally has no idea what he's talking about. He's just saying no because, quite frankly, somebody in his party said, just say no. And that's very, very frustrating. I think if we can blast through that, and today in the Senate with these meetings that we're going to have, hopefully we blast through that and we win this race.
Okay, we're almost at time, so just one quick final question for you all. What comes next after market structure? I feel like stablecoin, market structure have been the talk of the town in crypto for a long time. What is the big issue in crypto that comes next for Congress?
Go ahead.
I'll jump in because for me this is really important in my mind. I think decentralized finance in a turbocharged way where money can be transferred, especially using AI. So I think that marriage of AI and a modern financial system is probably what comes next. Look, there's somebody watching here, somebody listening here that will win that particular race, but we just don't know. If we all knew, we'd all be very wealthy.
I'd add let's assume clarity passes, getting the regulations not only right, but done on time. Financial regulators have a history of missing deadlines. We could look back to legislation passed over 10 years ago that still isn't completed. Getting this done on time and accurately is going to be absolutely essential, and the committees with oversight roles have a huge obligation to help do that.
AI, capital, and I'll end with, I think, something really important for all those folks back home. Fraud prevention, we've got that in GUARD, we've got that in TAPS Act, two really good pieces that I think will allow credibility in this space so that it doesn't just become a room this size who's participating in digital assets, but the entire country takes it on board.
Tokenization, right? Like allowing stocks to be traded 24/7 all around the world. And I don't know that there needs to be legislative action. That's primarily with the SEC, but allowing whether it be Coinbase or E-Trade or Robinhood to trade 24/7, all of their equities, all their prefers, all their debt. I think that's a huge unlock for the market. It'll globalize the U.S. capital markets in a way that hasn't occurred in the past, and it gives access to retail investors who are looking for an ability to invest and have a much more liquid market. We have a very non-liquid market because of the fact that it doesn't trade 24/7.
Just 10 seconds. Also democratizing the access to the financial system. I think bringing that down to everyday Americans is really, really important as well, so that they have access, like anybody else does, to a modern financial system.
Okay, awesome. I guess we'll wrap it there. Thank you so much all for joining me.
Thank you.